You may have seen Continental Connections in France where myself, Lauriane and Dan tackled a variety of venues. One of those venues we did fish was a gravel pit. It was quite tricky, but I did manage to catch a few. So I'm just going to talk you through my approach and how I managed to make the trip to that venue a success. So the first and foremost consideration on any venue is the location, and that of course was what I was thinking when we arrived at the gravel pit. Because it's not just a gravel pit like in the UK where it's closed off, it's actually connected to a river, so carp can come and go, and especially this time of year when they're looking at spawning, I do think that there's going to be a lot of movement between the river going in and out of that gravel pit, and I knew I wanted to be there. Without even going out with the echo or anything, I knew that this was going to be an interception point for the carp, so it was a big focus for me. I jumped straight in there where I had the mouth of that river to fish to. The next thing to do was go out and map the area in front of me, and to be honest, what I found, it gave me very few options, but that was probably a good thing. Right in front of me, it was 21 foot, it was deep, it was barren, and I just couldn't see the carp wanting to feed there. Where I could see them wanting to feed was on the opposite margin. There was a lot of snags in the water, nice sort of sloping margins that I knew that they'd get up into, especially when that sun was beating down on them. It just looked perfect, and it didn't take me long to think about placing all my rods over there. One spot in particular really did look amazing. There was a tree in the water, a little bit of it was sticking out. When I went out with the echo, I found a really clear, rock hard patch. It was showing up white on the deeper. I knew that this was going to be an area that the fish wanted, but that whole margin I was interested in. Also, I wanted to fish either side of the river opening because I knew that when they came in, they'd either have to go left or right, and I wanted a rod there to intercept them whichever way they may go. So it was quite easy for me to decide where I was going to place my rods because of how little I actually had. For me, all the signs, the time of year, everything pointed in the direction of placing rods along that far margin. These carp, they're not stocked fish, they're wild fish, and because of that, there's a chance that these fish have never seen boilies before in their life. I'm sure they have come across them at some point. Again, they are in the river, and people do carp fish the river, but they don't come across boilies every single day. However, with wild fish, once you get them on boilies, they love them and they become so easy to trip up. So I did want to include boilies a lot in my mix, but I needed a way of making them realise that it was an actual food source, because sometimes, because it's so unrecognisable to them, they don't even realise it's food. So I'm adding to that boilie mix a lot of particle, a lot of tiger nuts, and actually the natural boosters. The mussel blend or the brine and shrimp gammas I find is a great sort of cold water natural booster, and that's what I add to the mix to really incentivise those wild carp to investigate the mix I'm putting out there and recognise it as food. The particle does the same thing. I find that particle and tigers, they're a really nice crossover bait between pure natural food and angler's bait, and that's why I add a lot to my boilies, because I really find that, I don't know whether it's the sensation of the feeding on it or the fact that it looks very similar to food items that they come across naturally, but the wild carp seem to be a lot more naturally turned on to particle and nuts than they are boilies. So adding that into the mix means that they're more likely to get on it in the first place. They then start feeding on the boilies, and once they're on the boilies, they become very easy to catch. I wasn't concerned about a super tight baiting approach. For me, spring fishing is all about fishing areas. The carp, they've not really found the spots that they're obsessed with feeding on, where all the naturals are collecting, because the naturals haven't really blossomed yet. They're more focused on feeding in areas. And one thing you've got to remember about carp as well is that they don't have a stomach. They've just got one long intestine, and the speed at which they can digest food depends on their metabolism, which depends largely on the temperature of the water. And right now, it's pretty cold. I know the days are quite warm, but the water temperature is still pretty cold. They can't sit on one spot eating loads of food at once because their body just doesn't allow it at this time of year. By having a big spread of bait, it allows them to come down, have a mouthful, come back up, investigate the area, go drop back down again, feed, and they're staying in that area without having to stay on one spot. And that's why I'm doing a big spread of bait at this time of year. So I baited pretty much that whole margin. I would condense areas where I was going to place a rod, but that whole margin did get a bit of bait because I wanted the fish to stay there, conjugate to that area, and then drop down on my baited rigs. The spot was about 200 to 250 yards away, and when you're fishing at that distance, you've only got one choice when it comes to bite indication, and that is using braid for your main line. So it was an obvious choice for me to be using braid. When I'm fishing super long distances And when I know there's a few snags in the water, I actually like to use a floating braid because I get worried that the sinking braid gets pulled into structure in the bottom and it can cause a few problems. So when I'm fishing a long way, I always use floating braid. You need elasticity when you're fishing with braid because if you don't, you're going to rip the hook out of fish's mouths. It's important that you've got that little bit of bungee in your setup to compensate for the fight of the fish so that you're not just ripping the hook straight out its mouth, and you can actually cause quite a lot of damage by doing that. So it's important you've got some elasticity. A lot of people will use mono snag leader, which is great. It is a good product, and the only issue I have with it is it's got very, very high memory, which means it can become quite coily. I don't like it, it's not very neat. And I'll only use it if I really, really have to because of the snags. Now, there were snags in front of me, but they weren't so severe that I felt like I had to use mono snag leader. So what I've been using recently are fused leaders. They're 1 metre long and they've got so much stretch in them that you can get away with just that short metre leader section, and that will give you all the elasticity, all that bungee you need to play carp safely and effectively when fishing braid. I'm a massive fan of them. I really, really like them. The only thing you've got to be aware of is you need to straighten them out when you get them out of the packet because they'll be quite coily. I lick my fingers, pull them down, use a bit of friction to get them nice and straight. And yeah, I've only been using them recently, but I'm a massive fan of them. At the top of the leader, I'll put an 8mm tungsten bead, and this will allow me to actually put a back lead directly at the end of that leader. So once I've dropped my rig, I can then put a back lead down. It will slide, stop at that tungsten bead. I know that that area there is absolutely pinned down out of the way of feeding fish. Again, this is something I've only been doing recently in the past sort of 9 months, and I found it to be really effective. I love the fact that you can keep that line completely out of the way of the fish, and especially when you're using floating braid, if you don't have that back lead, I feel like sometimes it can lifting up and it can cause some presentation issues. So for me, that's a big addition to the setup that I like to use. You don't lose fish on claw hooks. And I'll take that to the grave with me. If you know me, you know that I love using a Ronnie rig, and it was no different here. I think a lot of people think when you go over to Europe, you've got to change your rig up completely so that it's a bit more brutal, a bit more agricultural and suited for this hard European fishing. But for me, you don't. You can use exactly what you use in the UK. You might need to change a few components depending on the type of fishing you're doing. If you're snag fishing, if you need to give them a little bit more, but the mainstay of that rig is exactly how I always use it. I like to take a 20-pound section of semi-stiff skin link. This for me is the best boom section you can use. I don't like to use something that's completely stiff unless I absolutely have to, because I like having that mix between a kick away and not kicking away completely straight, because when that happens, if the fish comes from a certain direction, it's quite difficult for the hook to actually fly back into the fish's mouth. By having a semi-stiff one, you get a bit more of a curve in your hook link, and it means that if a fish comes directly on and feeds on that hook bait, it can actually fly back into the fish's mouth better. So for me, it's really important to use a semi-stiff hook link. A lot of people will fish their Ronnie rigs with the hook bait directly on the shank, and I used to do this, used to get funny hook holds, and I was speaking to Tom Foreman in the office once, and he said, try adding a bit of separation to it. I achieve this through either tying on a slip D myself, or I use a little D-rig kicker, something that we're going to be bringing out in the future at Nash. And I found that having a bit of separation is very, very key to having better hook holds and landing more fish. Normally, when I'm using a Ronnie claw, I'll use a size 6 floater claw, and I'll only change from this when I'm snag fishing. It's not about the size of the fish. I've caught carp to nearly 80 pounds on a size 6 floater claw, so I know that the hook is strong enough itself. However, if I'm fishing close to snags and I need to give them a little bit more, I will go up to a size 6 claw or even a size 5 claw. Exact same pattern, so the only difference is that wire gauge, and that's why I'm stepping up to a claw when I'm snag fishing. In this instance, I was using a size 5 claw, just so that when I hook them initially, I can just pull them away from that tree, give them a bit of extra pressure, and then it's plain sailing, playing them in from the bank or going out in the boat. When it comes to the hook bait that I choose, it's spring, so I'm going for bright hook baits. Again, also because of how I'm baiting, a big spread and quite a lot of bait, I want to have something that stands out. And again, because these are wild fish, I want something that stands out, really sparks their interest and gets them to come down and investigate. So I glug them up quite heavily as well to add loads of extra attraction. Because I'm fishing them on a Ronnie setup, I don't need them to be super, super buoyant, so I can get away with them being quite heavily glugged. And I just feel like those extra amount of attraction leaking off really does help pull the carp in. I think that the pink one is the best. As we get a little bit further into spring and everything warms up a little bit more, I found yellow to be better as a general rule. But in this early spring period, pink is the one, and that's what I was catching on at the gravel pit. As I'm sure you saw, it was quite windy as well, and at times that can make boat work quite difficult. Not for someone like Lolo, who does this type of fishing every day of the week, but for someone like myself, who I'm not always out in a boat, I was aware that that wind was coming in, it was going to make things quite difficult. So it was really important that I got back on the spots that were doing the bites. Thankfully, I did have a few horizon markers lined up, and because I'm fishing straight to the opposite bank, I know exactly if I line up for that horizon marker, go straight for it, look on the deeper and see that depth, because we've got that sloping margin. Once I'm on that depth, I know if I'm lined up on that horizon marker, that I'm exactly where I need to be. I've also, just to be sure, I put some waypoints in the deeper so that I know when I'm over it, I've got the horizon marker, I've got the depth on the deeper, and I've got the waypoint. I know I'm bang on the spot. It's a case of dropping the rig, throwing the bait in, and coming back to the bank. Again, because of that wind, if I could play them from the bank, I would. And I did have quite a clear area in front of me. So as long as I pulled them away from that far margin, away from those snags, I was quite happy to play them in from the bank. If they did get in those snags, obviously I did have to go out in the boat. But to be honest, I was trying to limit my time out in that boat, get back to those spots that were doing the bite, get the rig down, get back to the bank and make the most of the weather, because the carp were loving the wind. It was making things difficult with the boat, but they seemed to like it.
It's windy!
20 kilos, that's the magic number in Europe. So to land 2 carp over that, yeah, I was ecstatic. It was a great session. I loved it. I hope you enjoyed watching it as well. If you do something quite similar to this in your own angling, I hope there's a few pointers there that you can take on board that will help you catch a few carp as well.